Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so the power supply for my eGPU fried, my MacBook Pro had a hardware failure that I had to take it in and have it shipped off for repair. Everything's failing in my home right now. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we're covering part 3 of Absolute Carnage. And part 2, really parts 1 and part 2, because remember, the first issue split into 3 parts. The first 2 parts, it was basically panic mode, right? It was the idea that Cletus Kasady had essentially returned. Now, the way that Donny Cates had written this is that Cletus Kasady had been coming back for a while. It's just that right now, Eddie Brock just realized what was really happening, right? He just realized that Cletus Kasady's made his return. And I love the way that Donny Cates wrote that, right? Because for the person who's kind of getting into Carnage and doesn't really know anything about the character, it's like, cool, a new symbiote. For people who are familiar with Carnage, it's like, cool, an old symbiote, and a lot of people are going to die. But it's one of these things where kind of like your dedication and your sort of time spent with the character of Cletus Kasady over the years is kind of rewarded, right? Because like this is the return. This is like the joke if the Joker got the Venom symbiote, right? Like a crazy person becomes Venom and then like loses their minds. But the idea behind this is that we're basically dealing with them going and grabbing Norman Osborn. Now, we talked about this in the last video, and we'll kind of refresh it a little bit for those of you guys who are you know, kind of coming into this. So if you're watching the full story version of this, we'll kind of be repeating ourselves for a second. But the idea behind Norman Osborn becoming the really the Red Goblin, right? The Carnage and the Goblin concept was to kind of try to reinvigorate Norman Osborn, right? To kind of like give him a new status quo after the events of Dark Reign. In reality, you don't really need to, right? There are some villains out there in the realm of comic books, the Joker, Lex Luthor, characters like Norman Osborn, who's probably, while he's not certainly the most iconic Spider-Man villain, I'd say he's probably the most important. And so what they did is Marvel basically said, let's give him the Carnage symbiote and then in turn have him bring back the Green Goblin, so he basically becomes the Red Goblin. And it was really popular for a little while, right? Like it's one of the more popular stories involving the various symbiotes. I would say it's more popular because it involves a symbiote as opposed to just the Green Goblin himself. But again, he's a legacy villain, right? So it's one of those things you don't have to really change a lot often. What you end up having here is Spider-Man and you have Venom, who basically race off to grab Norman Osborn. And this is kind of an important thing here, right? Because with Norman Osborn as the Red Goblin, I wouldn't say he pushed the symbiote to new heights by virtue of like his intelligence and so on and so forth. It was really more like merging with the Green Goblin and the Venom symbiote that kind of pushed it to new heights. But Norman Osborn is not an unintelligent guy. And the real question, the idea behind this is that with Venom really realizing what's going on and this idea that Cletus Kasady is running around and tracking these codexes, right? Like trying to kill the various individuals who have been symbiote hosts. The question is, we kind of have to save Norman Osborn. Now, it's interesting here because on the surface, you would say, well, then let him die, right? Like just let Norman Osborn die. And it's one of those funny things because it's really more of the moral quagmire of Venom and Spider-Man. What kind of superheroes would they be if they just let Norman Osborn die, right? I mean, that's kind of the issue that you run into here. What kind of heroes would they be if they let this guy die? And that was basically the end of it. And so again, it's kind of intriguing because in the midst of all this, suddenly you end up having Spider-Man who goes nuts. And this is one of the more important things that Donny Cates is doing here. Again, we talked about this in the first couple parts and it bears repeating here, but the idea is that in years past, right, going all the way back to like, even you go to like David Michelinie's original like Venom Lethal Protector, but like you go all the way back to like when Carnage was first introduced and even before that when Venom was introduced and all the various symbiotes between them, right, like Scream and Riot and all those guys. The way this always worked, and it was kind of etched in stone by Venom, is that when a person becomes a host, the symbiote can leave, right? Like if by, you know, by whatever manner and whatever means, if the symbiote leaves, the symbiote takes memories of that person with them, right? So that was the case of Venom, knowing the identity of Peter Parker. The Venom symbiote had bonded to Peter, it was cast off in Web of Spider-Man 45, and then it bonded itself to Eddie Brock, taking the knowledge of Peter Parker's identity of Spider-Man with it. And so the reason why that's important is because what this does is it basically allows Donny Cates to build on that concept and say, actually what happens is for all those individuals who have been a host of the Carnage symbiote, it leaves back, or it leaves behind itself a kind of sample, right? Like a kind of little genetic code that the Carnage symbiote that Cletus Kasady can tap into. Now, the big question to ask here, and this is kind of the big thing to come out of this, can Venom do the same thing? Can they tap into and can they basically control the minds of other individuals by using that genetic code? One of the other big changes that Donny Cates is making here is Carnage's ability to spawn more symbiotes. What Cletus is doing here is basically creating these little mini pods, and then they're forcing themselves into various prisons, going into the bodies of those particular prisoners, and then basically creating more symbiotes, so to speak. Now, it's kind of interesting here because these aren't really Carnage symbiotes in the traditional sense, which is to say they're not really like duplicates of himself. They're really more akin to like children. And that's why this is cool, because if you look at this, it looks like Like, you literally have Donny Cates building up this army of soldiers, more or less, for Carnage, who in turn can allow him to try to defeat Null, the symbiote god. That's kind of where I hope this is going to, that you end up having Carnage and Spider-Man and Venom all teaming up to face off against Null, and then like truly and successfully defeat him. Like, it'd be kind of cool, but it's kind of one of these funny things, because as that goes off, you know, as this begins to go down, you end up having, of course, the sound system that's triggered, and then with the sound system being triggered, as we know with symbiotes, they hate like loud sonic vibrations, and so where Eddie goes to take them out, it allows him and Peter to basically team up and try to face off against the forces of Carnage. But that's where things begin to go awry, because at the outset, you simply expect it to just be Cletus Kasady, right? Like, you expect it to just be him and go walking in, because the reality of this is that you go back and you look at like Maximum Carnage, the Maximum Carnage storyline, you go back and look at the time that like Eddie and Spider-Man first fought Venom before Maximum Carnage, and you're talking about a symbiote out there that's stronger than the two of them, right? So Cletus Kasady alone would be enough to overtake and to basically defeat Spider-Man and Venom. And so this is designed to illustrate one or two things, or possibly both. The first is that it's designed to basically show that like all these different characters are designed to show up and basically cause absolute pandemonium, right? Like bolstering the numbers of Carnage's forces. The other half of this, and this is what I think is actually a little more interesting, is that Cletus Kasady is getting arrogant. I can send my forces forward and have them do it for me. Now, in reality, if Cletus Kasady is getting carried away with himself, and if he's being arrogant, then it's with good reason, because you basically have like all these different forces that are pretty much overtaking Venom and Spider-Man, and they're doing a pretty darn good job at it, right? I mean, that's kind of the nature of things, is you're talking about these exceedingly strong and powerful versions of Carnage, really like more of the Grindles than anything else. They're just kind of ripping things up. And so in the midst of all this, where Peter kind of gets, you know, thrown to the side, he's met by the arrival of Cletus. And that's when things really get scary, right? Because Cletus is a man without reason. And that's what makes Cletus so dangerous, is because of the fact that he's a believer, right? He believes that what he's doing is right. He believes that what he's doing is the correct thing to do. And you can't sway him from that belief. He's a guy that just cannot be changed. And so what happens when you give a person who cannot be changed the power to force change onto other people? They're going to do exactly that. They're going to basically create a litany of reasons for why you're wrong, and then force their entire perspective onto you, right? So either you can reject it or you can accept it, but you're not going to be able to get them to change what it is that they're doing. And that's what's so cool about this, is because you basically have like Venom fighting off against Peter, and it's one of these cool little moments, because when that happens, Venom actually sort of chastises Peter for a second and says, stop being clever, stop being funny, stop cracking jokes. This is time for business. And that's an important thing. But one of the things that Dan Slott established during the original Spider-Man Renew Your Vows as part of Secret Wars is there's a reason why Peter does this, but there's no reason to do it here. One of the big questions people had all the time for years and years and years, Peter would crack jokes in the middle of fights. And people always sort of attributed that to the fact that Peter was just a character who would joke around. But there's a reason for why Peter does this. So really, it took decades to get to the point where we could actually get an explanation to it. But during the original Renew Your Vows, Dan Slott stated that the reason why Peter does that is because it throws his enemy off, right? It frustrates his enemy and makes him angry, because the enemy believes Peter doesn't respect them, right? Like, I'm not taking this fight seriously because you're not really anybody to worry about. This is business as usual, and you're of no real concern to me. That's the message Peter puts off, right? The other idea is to kind of keep things loose and to keep Peter from getting carried away, keep him from getting like super overexcited, and to kind of keep him grounded and in the moment. But it's as much to like screw with the other guy. The issue with this is that with Cletus Kasady, that don't work. That dog don't bark, right? Because Cletus Kasady doesn't take the bait. That's the nature of it. Cletus Kasady is about as crazy, you know, or not really as crazy. He's crazier than Spider-Man. So like cracking jokes, going on about nonsense, it doesn't really work. And that's why Venom says it's not the time to be clever. It's not the time to be funny. It's not the time to like crack jokes and be your usual self. This is the time to be serious, because if we're not, we could die here today. And Peter knows that, but Venom doesn't know that Peter knows that. It's just Peter's way of doing things. This is kind of how Peter is. And so following this, the two of them are basically like knocked out of this cell, you know, sent flying out into the hallway. And that's when Peter basically begs for Carnage not to kill Norman Osborn. And that's when he says, I'm not here to kill him. I'm here to add him to my forces. It's literally Carnage absorbing Norman Osborn into himself and basically turning Norman Osborn into one of his various henchmen. Now, Norman Osborn does not have the Grendel insignia on his forehead. And the indication here is that Norman Osborn is something wholly new. Like it may be that he's something wholly different and wholly new. Probably not. He's probably just like all the other ones, right? There's nothing really special about him. But I have a hard time believing Donny Cates wouldn't have him depicted in this manner if he wasn't different from everybody else. So I'm really excited. I'm really curious to see where it goes. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.